Mara had sold wreaths at the edge of the Campus Martius for so many days that she knew the season by the change in voices. In ordinary weeks the passers-by were lawyers, muleteers, slaves on errands, and boys running for bread and olives. But when the great games came, the crowd widened and sharpened. Senators in bordered togas moved with their clients, women in veils came in pairs, soldiers on leave laughed too loudly, and strangers from the hills stood staring at the city as if its stone itself were a wonder. This year people spoke of something older than any of the temples around them. They said the emperor had ordered the ludi seculares, that is, the secular games, after a long pause of many years, and that the rites belonged not to the ordinary calendar, but to the turning of an age. Mara had heard old men say that such games came only when Rome wished to cleanse herself and begin again. Others said they were a fine show to please the crowd and glorify the ruler. To Mara, they meant business. Pilgrims and citizens alike wanted garlands, ribbons for their children, and little bunches of laurel to hold while they watched. Her father had once told her that during the great rites, the city tried to look as if it stood in the favor of the gods. The day before the first ceremonies, teams of laborers had swept the streets near the Tiber, altars were set up, and wood smoke drifted from sacrificial fires. Mara carried her basket to the edge of the river in search of customers, where the air smelled of wet reeds, animal blood, and the sour tang of horses. She could hear the lowing of beasts brought for offering, and the rough commands of priests and attendants. Everywhere there was preparation, and beneath it a sense of tension, like a cord pulled tight. A man in a dark cloak, his beard carefully trimmed, chose 2 garlands and paid without haggling. "You'll do well this week," he said. "If the gods are kind," Mara replied. He gave a thin smile. The gods are always kind to emperors. When he was gone, she looked after him, wondering whether he had meant it as praise or warning. She had never seen the emperor close at hand, only as a pale shape in a passing litter once, a face framed by soldiers and distance. Yet his will reached even into her trade. The secular games were said to have been revived under Augustus, and now they were being celebrated again under the reigning emperor, with sacrifices to deities ancient and solemn, and performances meant for the people. The city spoke of them in reverence and curiosity. Priests consulted records, storytellers repeated the number of years by which the ceremonies were delayed. Boys boasted of the night spectacles they had been promised. On the first evening, Mara found a place with other women near enough to the open spaces where the rites would be seen, but not so near that soldiers would push them back. Lamps glowed in clusters, the marble and brick of the city took on a warmer color in the torchlight, and the air carried the mingled scents of oil, wine, sweat, and incense. She had wrapped her shawl tighter against the night chill, but her skin still prickled whenever the crowd surged. Nevertheless, Mara was on the restless watch for customers. As the priests approached in ordered procession, their garments seemed almost to float above the stones. Behind them came the offerings, adorned with ribbons, their hooves striking sparks in the dark. Mara heard someone whisper that black animals were being offered to the underworld powers, as tradition required for such rites. She did not know whether every detail was true, but she saw the seriousness on the faces around her, and the way the crowd fell quiet when the flame rose and the chant began. A man near her murmured, "Our grandparents never saw this." Their grandparents did, perhaps. "Do you think it matters?" she asked before she could stop herself. He glanced at her, surprised to be addressed by a seller in a plain wool dress. "If the city is old enough, everything matters." The answer satisfied her more than it should have. Rome was always speaking of itself as if it were a living thing with organs and memory. This was one of the moments when that seemed less like boast and more like truth. The rites went on over many days. There were sacrifices at dawn and at night, and public distributions that filled the streets with people carrying what they had been given, as if they had won something from the gods themselves. Mara sold every garland she had made before the second sunrise, so she made more with her mother and younger brother in the narrow room they rented off a narrow street behind the portico. Their fingers were stained green from laurel leaves, but they worked through the night, by lamplight, listening to the city outside. At times the noise was like a festival, with singing, laughter, and vendors calling. At others it was quieter, and then one could hear the footsteps of processions moving somewhere beyond the walls and colonnades. Rome had never felt so crowded, or so watched. On the third day, Mara was sent to buy flour and onions, near a street where one of the public performances would take place. She carried her basket, and paused when she saw a group of children gathered outside a cordon of ropes. Their faces were streaked with dust and excitement, and a boy not much younger than her brother stood on tiptoe. "What are they waiting for?" Mara asked. "Shows," the boy said, as if that explained everything in the world. "And sacrifices. My uncle says there will be chariot races after." Another child scoffed. "No, there are songs first." All of them were corrected by the old woman beside them, who claimed to know the order of events by heart. She spoke of recitations, of theatrical pieces, of the solemn offerings that gave the games their name. Mara listened while balancing her basket on one hip, thinking that Rome was a place where even piety had spectacles. When she reached the market, she found the price of flour had risen again. The seller shrugged, with no shame at all, saying that the games were good for business. She paid and left with less resentment than she expected. The emperor's ceremonies had made the city rich for some and burdened for others. That, too, was part of Rome. On the final night of the games, she and her family went together to watch the closing ceremony. Her mother had pinned her best bronze brooch to her tunic, and her brother, who had tried to act bored all afternoon, could not hide his excitement once they joined the moving tide of people. They passed under arches hung with greenery and through shadows where torch smoke blurred the stars. Somewhere ahead, musicians were playing. Somewhere else, an official voice called for order. Mara found herself standing beside a freedman who sold lamps and knew every street in the district. He said, without preamble, "If these rites truly bring a new age, what kind will it be?" Mara considered this while the crowd pressed forward. "One where I must pay more for flour," she said at last. He laughed, then caught himself and lowered his voice. "A practical answer. But a true one," she said. They fell silent as the ceremony began. The official prayers rolled out across the darkness, and the crowd answered in places where it had been instructed to do so. Above them, the heavens were clear and severe. Mara thought of her own small life, of wreaths made and sold, of hands blackened by sap, of her mother counting coins under a jar. None of this would be written on tablets or sung by poets. Yet here it was, tied for a moment to the great business of empire, to old rites revived, to the hope that an age might be made clean by sacrifice and song. Later there were games of another sort, and the noise of the crowd turned wild with pleasure. Men shouted wagers, children squealed. Someone near Mara dropped an amphora and cursed. She caught only glimpses of the track and the movement of bodies, but the energy of the city ran through her like fever. She understood why rulers loved such occasions. They were not only worship. They were memory made visible and the living instructed to feel part of something larger than themselves. When it was over, and the streets began to empty, Mara walked home beside her family with a bundle of unsold ribbons under her arm. The moon hung above the roofs, pale and patient. Her brother talked sleepily about what he had seen, and her mother answered in low tones. From some distance came the last echoes of celebration, fading into the ordinary murmurs of the night. At the doorway, Mara paused and looked back toward the center of the city, where the temples and public spaces still held their lamps. Rome stood massive and unchanged, yet for a few days it had dressed itself in ancient seriousness and bright display, as if afraid the world might forget who it was. Mara touched the laurel leaves in her basket and smiled to herself. In the morning, the streets would need sweeping again, the altars would cool, and people would return to their bargains and complaints. But she had seen the city at its most ceremonious, and she would remember the smell of incense on the wind, the white flash of victims led to sacrifice, the murmured names of powers older than the empire itself. If an age truly ended and began again, it was not with thunder, she thought, but with the careful lighting of lamps, with hands tying garlands, with the crowd holding its breath, while men in sacred dress spoke to the gods on behalf of Rome.